Hello plant lovers, Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Hello plant lovers, and this is a channel where I share my growing adventures of cold, cool and intermediate orchids here in Melbourne with no fancy equipment, greenhouses, humidifiers, heated rooms, etc, etc. They either survive inside or outside or out of the pool. I do post every week, so hit subscribe if that sounds of any interest and you can join me on my very amateur adventures, which today are going to focus on this baby, which actually just breaks all those rules I just explained. Why? Because this, plant lovers, is neither cold, cool, or intermediate. This is a stunning orchid. Just look at the depth of the color of those flowers and the form of them. It's just beautiful. And it is called Phaiocalanthe Kryptonite Parkside. Ta-da! There we go. Now, this is one of those mega mixes between two different types of orchids. So its parentage is Phaius, I think that's how you pronounce it. I'll put the name in here, which is an Asian warm growing terrestrial orchid that loves to grow in quote unquote moist depressions with black soil. So there's a clue as to how to grow it. And its other parent is Calanthe vestita, which is another terrestrial orchid type. Again, though, it is a warm grower, and it is found in the peninsula that includes Myanmar and Thailand and Vietnam, etc. Whereas the other parent, the Phaius, grows mainly in China, Taiwan, and other parts of the Pacific. So slightly different regions. They've been brought together in love and matrimony to produce this beautiful baby, which, as you can imagine, does take a lot of the growing characteristics of both parents, which are neither cold, cool or intermediate. Why did I buy this? Because I'm a fool and I've broken my rule, but I do think hopefully I can make it survive inside. Now obviously in my climate here in Melbourne, this is an inside orchid, and I have decided that the minimum temperature in winter of the house is always going to be warm enough to enable this baby to survive. So it's in the warmest spot of the house. I cannot take any credit for these amazing blooms you can see here, because I did buy the plant and it had a flower spike. In fact, it's got 3. So no credit there, but I think I can take credit for not killing it, given that it has quite specific requirements. So let's go through a few of those. So firstly, as you can imagine, because of its parentage, a lot of calanthes, so I have cooler climate calanthes, and they very much are deciduous. They're sort of herbaceous perennials, essentially. They die down and they come up. They're very happy in sort of a more of a woodland environment with dappled shade, and I grow mine outdoors all year, and they're pretty much exposed to the elements. They get a little bit of protection from trees, but they're rained on or not. I do water them in summer if it gets a little bit dry, but otherwise they kind of fend for themselves. So this one, obviously different climatic conditions in terms of temperature. So one of its parents though, essentially is almost like a bog plant. So that's the thing. Half its parentage is boggy, the other half is a deciduous terrestrial. So you put the two together in perfect harmony, and here we are. So what does that mean? It means, firstly, it likes brighter light. So mine is in the brightest spot of the house. It doesn't get direct light. If I was in somewhere warmer, where it could be outside, I would give it quite bright morning dappled light and then stronger shade in the afternoon. But inside, I'm just giving it fairly constant, bright, indirect light. Now, the other thing is, you can see that I have kind of got it in this vessel, which is actually, if you are remotely interested, it's an antique Japanese lacquer censer. So it would have been used for burning incense. Anyway, it has a copper lining, which makes it actually perfect for keeping a plant of this nature, because, plant lovers, I'm actually treating this baby almost like a carnivorous plant. Now, carnivorous plants, as we know, need to sit in a tray of water because they need to be moist all the time. And this baby, because one of its parents is a moist loving, or what was it? A moist depression with dark soil. So I am keeping mine, unlike any other orchid I have, essentially moist all the time, and the tray that it is sitting in is always moist in the bottom. So every morning I tip some water in the bottom there, not a huge amount, but just enough so that the bottom is always moist and that the plant can uptake the moisture it wants. It's quite humid in there, and I also water it from the top every morning, even though it is midwinter here in Melbourne. Now, I haven't had this for a full year, obviously, so I cannot talk to this completely, but it does become deciduous. And as you can see, that leaf is starting to die off. So according to my reading, it's quite common that the leaves start to turn as the flowers emerge, and it tends to flower in winter. Once it is spent, once it's dropped its leaves and the flowers are finished, it can be semi-deciduous or deciduous and needs a little bit of a drier rest, but not a dry rest as you might imagine a dendrobium is going to take. I think the dryness with this means that it's just not as moist as it normally is. So I will still water it, but not quite as much. It then, like many of those terrestrial orchids in spring, is going to go through a growing spurt, and it's at that point that you really need to ramp up the watering. Well, I will. Again, I don't know because I haven't had it for a full year. So the other thing I have read is that they are quite heavy feeders. So it is, as you can see, plant lovers, still in its plastic pot, and you know my feelings about plastic pots. However, sometimes you just got to compromise. But what I will do in spring when it starts its new growth is repot it. And the potting mix that I will use is much more of a terrestrial orchid based one. So I'm going to use essentially the sort of mix I will use in my cymbidiums with still a little bit of perlite and a little bit of charcoal just to keep it nice and loose. But essentially free draining, but a bit more moisture retaining and a bit denser than your average orchid mix. And in that I will put quite a bit, perhaps more than usual, of a slow release fertilizer pellet. In the meantime though, about every week I am giving this a diluted solution of a liquid seaweed based fertilizer. So I dilute that to about 1/8 of the recommended dose. So it's getting much more regular food than perhaps any other orchids I have. But now let's look at the blooms. Aren't they just sensational? And this plant has 3 viable spikes. So this is the first one to come out. Unfortunately, it had a 4th, but it got snapped off in transit. Each spike has got, what has this one got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Wow, 11 blooms. Very happy orchid. What I've also read is that people trim off the leaves as they start to turn, so you just leave the orchid spikes just to make the plant look better, I suppose. But most of my leaves are still quite healthy, so I'm going to leave them on. Now, I've also read that there is a fragrance, and I'm here to tell you that there is nothing on mine. And maybe that's because it's indoors, maybe because the sun's not bright, maybe it's because it's winter. I don't know, maybe in a warmer climate with more sun, you get more fragrance, but this has absolutely no fragrance whatsoever. But all is forgiven because look at that color. What are we calling that? It's the most beautiful, rich burgundy. And as you can see, the back of the lip is a little bit paler. You see, it's got that beautiful sort of little, quite light pink undertone to the back of the lip. It's a really beautiful flower. So plant lovers, so far so good. I haven't managed to kill it. All the blooms have started to open. The flower spikes that were on it have grown and the flower buds are opening. I'm keeping it moist, I'm keeping it fertilized, I'm keeping it in a bright spot, I'm keeping it warm. And we'll see. The proof of the pudding is going to be if I can make this survive through to next year and if I can then get it to bloom again. So what we might have to do is a follow-up next spring to see A, if it's survived, B, if it's sent up new growth, and then in the following winter, if it's produced flower spikes. So this might be one of those plants to keep on our watch list. Now, I did make a video that included this plant because I'm sort of experimenting with some things, and this is one of the types I've experimented with, so I'll link that here. Aren't the blooms just beautiful? There we are, plant lovers. Thank you very much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed this. Isn't it just the most beautiful of orchids? I hope I can get it to survive and thrive next year and bloom again. We shall have to see. Anyway, until next week, thank you for watching. Do hit subscribe if you're interested, and I look forward to seeing you with another orchid adventure. Take care.